And of course, I lead a minority government in Scotland right now, so I know very well that a party in that position would need support from other parties. But crucial for me, of course, would be an acceptance that Scotland's future was up to the people of Scotland to decide, and that Westminster didn't have a veto over that.
Why is it that Nicola Sturgeon can say in an interview 2 weeks or so prior to the election being announced that obtaining a majority in any upcoming elections would not constitute a mandate? Yet we fast forward to the present day, and the very opposite has been stated now, or at the very least implied, by Helmet Head and her Rainbow Unicorn delegates, trying to bullshit the electorate into believing that if they obtain the majority of seats, then it somehow means they have the right to a referendum, which in itself will undoubtedly result in them obtaining the majority that they're talking about. But voting for them does not miraculously grant them the right to any referendum. The criteria from their mandate in 2016 has not been met, which of course means they have no legal basis to hold a referendum. Hence why they're essentially relying on a hung parliament, or failing that, a Labour Party that will fall short of a majority, either of which would allow these people to demand a referendum in exchange for any informal alliances. And there's part of me that thinks that one of those two outcomes is what's going to end up happening. Because there's got to be some other reason for why the SNP are allowed to do as they please and say as they please in relation to their campaign and the narrative and so on and so forth, whereas other parties from time to time tend to get called out.
And your timescale for that, just to clarify, is wanting a second independence referendum next year in 2020?
Yes.
And tonight?
Yes, and the reason for that is pretty straightforward.
Oh, is it? Straightforward, yes. That'll be the day. The answer being, of course, that the 2021 Scottish elections will wipe out their mandate, which essentially will refresh it. So failure to obtain a referendum before 2021 will kind of expose the SNP's true intentions for what they are. Independence was always their plan B, the insurance policy to fall back on if Brexit couldn't be stopped. Not once did independence get mentioned when they were gallivanting around the UK trying to get a so-called people's vote. All that time wasted trying to ensure the UK doesn't leave Europe has called into question their claims of wanting independence. In fact, at the beginning of this year, people were beginning to question their actions, and just so happens at that exact same time, they started talking about independence again. They've been able to get away with dismissing scrutiny up until this point by insisting that regardless of the results of their efforts to stop Brexit, Scotland should have a right to determine its own future. Despite the fact, of course, that if Brexit is stopped, they'd have no mandate, like they currently don't have. Anyway.
Because Scotland is at a crossroads, the whole of the UK is at a crossroads, and we need to be able to determine.
And if you're of the belief that this has nothing to do with the 2021 elections, then just ask yourself why any of the bullshit that Sturgeon will inevitably use here to justify why it has to be 2020 couldn't be done at a later date.
Which path we want to take. And, the choice is very stark. Either we are taken down a path by Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn or whatever Westminster politician is in Downing Street, a path that we haven't chosen. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU.
I am sick fucking hearing her saying that. She knows full well that the people she's talking about that voted to remain in Europe, a good portion of them, voted that way because of what she said to them. Stating to these people, a few days prior to the referendum, that the premise for independence wouldn't arise if they voted to leave. The people that we are talking about in this regard are the people that made up the bulk of votes that the SNP obtained in the two elections between 2014 to 2016, which saw them obtain a record level amount of seats at Holyrood as well as Westminster. Now that clearly was linked to the referendum of 2014. You don't go from losing a referendum to obtaining a record level of seats the year after. She completely hijacked what their vote encompassed, but she has the audacity 3 years on to use it as justification for her actions, pretending that she's only doing what she's doing because it's what the people of Scotland want. She's full of shit.
or we decide ourselves what kind of country we want to be. So that decision is fundamental, and I believe an independent Scotland could be a much fairer, more equal, more prosperous country, and of course we could sit at the top table in the
Oh man, the top table again. What is it with Sturgeon in this fucking table? Even if that table existed, it would only be Sturgeon who would get to sit at the top table. But realistically, she wants you to vote for independence to try and rejoin Europe so Sturgeon can sit at the non-existent top table with her colouring books so she can share with cousin Macron and Papa Verhofstadt, awaiting for the next orders from the Commission. Why don't you try and sort out the problems in your own country first, you thin-lipped wee wanker? Huh?
European Union wielding the kind of influence that we've all watched Ireland wield over the past 3 years.
Oh yeah, Ireland being used as nothing other than a political pawn is somehow equivalent to solidarity and power.
I want to just get back to the issue of timescale, though, because if you're wanting this independence referendum next year, Jeremy Corbyn has once again tonight ruled out you getting a second independence referendum in the early years of a Labour government. So does that rule out you giving him support, any kind of support, if he had a minority government?
Well, let me deal with that head on. But firstly, I think I have to say that Jeremy Corbyn's position on this does change almost every day. It's almost impossible to keep up.
That's really funny, Helmet Head. But at the end of the day, as far as we're aware, they've both ruled it out. But yet, one of your campaign pledges is a vote for the SNP is a vote to determine our own future. How's that one working out?
Up with it. But there is an issue of principle at stake here that I would expect any Westminster leader looking to the SNP for support to accept. And that principle is this, that of course there's a difference of opinion in Scotland about whether or not we should be independent. But it is up to the people of Scotland to decide that question.
And that question, of course, only exists because of the 2016 election mandate. The government should have a right to hold a referendum if there is circumstantial and material change, such as being taken out of the European Union against our quote-unquote will. And we're still in the European Union, so nothing has changed. Just because the understanding at present is that Brexit is supposed to happen, it hasn't happened, nor is it even set in stone that it will. Therefore, you have no mandate at present. Therefore, what the SNP are essentially trying to do is gain the rights to a referendum that they've got no legal grounds to obtain or hold. They've spent 3 years trying to stop Brexit. They're going to try to demand the referendum mentioned within their mandate, despite not having met the criteria. Waffling on about the moral and immoral practices of any future PM isn't going to fulfil the promises that her whole campaign is predicated on.
It's up to the people of Scotland through its elected Scottish Parliament to decide if there is another independence referendum and also
stop calling it that, for fuck's sake.
What timescale that should happen on. It's not for Westminster to dictate that.
Oh, but it's A-OK for Nicola Sturgeon to spend 3 years trying to stop Brexit. It's A-OK for Nicola Sturgeon to have a campaign pledge to try to stop Brexit if you vote her in again. It's A-OK for the SNP to team up with all the other little left-wing cancerous parties across the UK to try and stop Brexit. It's A-OK for Nicola Sturgeon to do and say as she pleases, but when things don't go her way, all of a sudden it's a different story.
So it's that issue of principle that is crucial. Of course, I would want to see a Labour government do other things as well, bring about a definitive end to austerity, an end to welfare cuts, look to take a very different approach than the Tories to migration.
Of course. What is it with this woman and fucking migration? What is it with her and migration? It is beyond me. I mean, you'd think at this point, if the demographic changes across England weren't a concern, the NHS reaching near enough breaking point might have been a point where they might have decided amongst themselves, a bit of consensus that maybe it's time to stop the free movement. But of course, yet again, Helmet Head, as well as all the rest of these lefties, still can't see any fault with the prospect of open borders.
To absolutely protect our NHS from trade deals and
our devolved NHS. Our devolved NHS, bear in mind.
Privatisation. So I drive a hard bargain, and first and foremost, I would want to make sure that Scotland's voice and Scotland's interests were heard and protected.
Oh, God, here we go again. The Scotland's been ignored routine has made a comeback as the little self-awareness that may or may not have existed still under that thin-lipped bowl cut has evaporated into nothingness. With the decision to refer back to the old classic, the old adage of Scotland's been ignored, despite the fact that there's been several court cases and a fucking Ben bill that had absolutely everything to do with the SNP as well as others.
The way that they simply haven't been at Westminster over these past few years.
All right, Nicola Sturgeon, what happens if Labour does come into power on December the 13th and they do indeed get a second new deal with the EU? The country goes to a second referendum on the EU, Remain wins. Scotland remains in the EU.
Well, they've got no mandate for a start, but that's something that they can't admit. It's something they've never admitted. You know, I recall Kirsty Blackman, in fact, I think the video's on my channel somewhere. Channel 4 interview from before the European Union elections, being asked a similar question, to which I had a real difficult time explaining the truth of the matter. And of course there was another one with Helmet Head and Andrew Marr from around May or April time. Same sort of response was witnessed. They couldn't come right out and say that there wouldn't be an urgent requirement for independence in the event of a Remain majority in a second referendum on Brexit, as that immediately would indicate that this is about remaining in Europe above all else. But they couldn't go all out the other way and make out that independence was the be-all and end-all, their number one priority, because first and foremost they'd have no mandate, and second of all, questions would start to be raised as to just why they're so focused on trying to stop the UK leaving the EU if independence was their true goal. But now time is not on Helmet Head's side, so rest assured the bullshit will flow rather freely this time around.
Does that cancel your rationale, your reasoning, your material change for wanting a second independence referendum for Scotland?
Material change, I love that. She just used a small quote from their mandate.
No, it doesn't. And the proposition that I'm putting to people in Scotland in this election is this. We have seen over the past 3 years, and Brexit is simply the illustration of this. Because
remember, this is absolutely all about independence, nothing at all whatsoever to do with Helmet Head's desire to keep us attached to Europe. 62% of falsely labelled Remainers, who in reality mainly consist of independent supporters, have to believe that this is why they voted the way that they did.
Future is not in our own hands, and Westminster governments can decide to impose a direction of travel and upon us and policies that we don't want upon us. And
absolutely nothing to do with Brexit and all about independence. Despite stating in her own article on her own website from today or yesterday that in the event of a second referendum coming back with Remain as the majority, the threat of Brexit would still linger for years to come, and that's something that Helmet Head just can't risk.
Therefore, that really illustrates the importance of Scotland deciding for ourselves what kind of country we want to be. And, you know, that question of are we going to continue to, you know...
Just like this thin-lipped bombstick has decided for you that independence and European Union membership are intertwined. Always have been and always will be. Just like she's decided to pretend that there's a climate emergency because Greta Thunberg told her to. She's decided to start redistributing our wealth to third sector organisations and redistributing our wealth to Malawi and Zambia, etc. under the pretext of a climate justice initiative because her paymasters at the UN told her to. Like she's decided for you that Brexit must be avoided by using independence because the European Union is all that matters. Yes, that's right. She's making a hell of a lot of decisions for people, and it seems that any decision that people in Scotland do get to make or may get to make are choices that Helmet Head herself decided that Scotland could decide upon.
Westminster elections where we cross our fingers and hope for, you know, the devil rather than the deep blue sea. We simply hope that Westminster governments don't impose austerity or Brexit or any other policies that we don't choose upon us, or is it time to take that future into our own hands? That's the kind of crossroads moment Scotland is at, and it has real implications for our public services, for our economy, for the prospects of future generations. Scotland's one of the wealthiest countries on the face of the planet. We've got natural and human resources that other countries only dream of. And
sure the European Union are delighted to get their hands on that.
And the question is, how do we maximise that potential as a country? And
have to be part of the European Union for that, I suppose.
I believe that's as an independent country, but fundamentally, I believe that it must be for people in Scotland, not Westminster, to decide the direction we take.
Just like you decided that an independent Scotland would go back into Europe, yeah.
If someone was coming fresh to the British political landscape right now, could you explain to them why you fight so hard to stay in one union and fight so hard to leave another?
Because she's a fucking hypocrite.
Well, you know, on the face of it, that's a good question, but I don't think you have to stop and think for too long to realise how absurd a question it is.
Oh, here we go.
If you went to France or Germany or Spain or Portugal and suggested to them that their membership of the European Union meant that they weren't independent countries, they would...
Oh, is that so, is it? Get a fucking grip, you bombstick. Why don't you explain the moves towards centralising all the European nations' own banks into the one bank, or the moves towards removing vetoes in relation to foreign policy, the moves towards integrating all the armed forces, or why don't you explain what happens upon failure to comply with the Commission's demands? To ask yourself, why is it that the European nations always seem to end up with some pro-European Union zealot, despite the complete contradictory opinions of the majority of the public from within these countries? Just how is it possible that Pedro Sanchez and Angela Merkel keep being re-elected, despite the fact everybody hates these wankers? Not independent in the slightest. But that suits this globalist socialist, as the thought of all that globalist internationalist policy and that African diaspora gets those thin lips tingling, doesn't it?
Look at you rather askance. All of these countries are independent, but they cooperate and collaborate, pool sovereignty where it makes sense.
What? But what was that there? What was that she just said?
Countries are independent, but they cooperate and collaborate, pool sovereignty where it makes sense.
Pool sovereignty where it makes sense.
In countries, they would probably look at you rather askance. All of these countries are independent, but they cooperate and collaborate, pool sovereignty where it makes sense in the European Union.
Peace.